Hello, class. Welcome to Lecture 8 and Week 9 of REL 155, Early and Medieval Church History at International University of the East. So this will be our final lecture of the spring 2024 quarter. Next week will be the final exam, so hopefully you'll be ready for that. I will have a short review session or study guide that we'll go over towards the end. Uh, Keep in mind, you can, if you would like any of the notes or a copy of the study guide, please email me and ask for that. So I'll be sure and email that to you. So let's get started today. And I also wanted to go over um, a couple final options I'm going to give you for um, extra credit for a field trip if you would like to attend one of these two. One is attend the International Festival at Shepherd of the Valley Presbyterian Church in Hacienda Heights. That's this Saturday, June the 8th, from 11 to 1. It may go a bit longer than that. I'm not quite sure how late it's going to go, but I plan to be there at least from 11 to 1. So if you're there, um, you can, or if you want to come, please come at that time so you can meet me there. And then two, attend a worship service at Angelus Temple on Thursday next week, June 13th, 2024 at 7 p.m. So I planned this for the final week in case you do take the evening class. Finals usually don't go quite that long, so hopefully you'll be done in time and you can come to that service afterwards. So I did pick this option on a Thursday because it is close to the school, and some of you are going to be there. So that's a possibility. Keep in mind, I did give you the previous Sunday, or again, if you do want to choose to go to some other church on Sunday, you can do that as well. Just be sure that you write the paper about it. But if I see you here, I will give you at least 5 points extra credits, and then you can write paper for an additional 5. So be sure that you find me if you go to one of these two places or one of these two events. I'll have an attendance sheet, so please find me and sign my attendance sheet. You may want to get my phone number from the syllabus so you can call me in case you can't find me, in case there's a big crowd and you can't find me. Probably more likely the case at the second option than the first, but just be sure that you can find me and sign my attendance sheet if you do want to come to those or one of those two. Okay, we'll move on to our lesson now, our final lesson for this term, with chapter 23, Chaos and the Law of Necessity, which is about the decline of the papacy. The 14th century appeared to begin in Europe in a pleasant manner. On February 22nd, 1300, Pope Boniface VIII proclaimed a jubilee or a holy year to celebrate the new centenary of Christ's birth. It was the first of its kind. The official decree announced a pardon for sins for all who visited the churches of St. Peter and St. Paul during the Holy Year. Of course, those are in Rome, so joyous masses came to Rome to visit these churches. Centuries later, Pope Paul VI echoed Boniface's words in announcing that 1975 would be another Holy Year. And as in the first Holy Year, Rome welcomed the masses who came. It's just a little foreshadowing of or bringing us to the present day, or at least closer to the present day. Boniface VIII, who was Pope from 1294 to 1303, the founder of the Holy Years, had a flair for ceremony. Several times he appeared before the pilgrims in imperial robes, claiming to be Caesar and emperor. His papal crown was noted for the extensive jewels within it: rubies, sapphires, emeralds, and pearls. Generous celebrants contributed an extensive amount of money to the Church of St. Paul. The decades ahead looked bright to Boniface because for 2 centuries the papacy had held an unrivaled peak of power, both religious and political. He had learned from the example of Innocent III, a pope highly skilled in imposing his will on emperors and kings, and he assumed he could continue the same practice. Within 3 years of the Jubilee, however, Boniface died of the shock of the greatest personal insults ever inflicted on a pope. Even as people joyfully celebrated the Jubilee, forces were at work that marked the beginning of the end of medieval papal sovereignty. Let's turn to sleep and change in the kingdom. Jesus once described the kingdom of God with a parable about a man who scattered seed on the ground. Night and day the seed sprouted and grew without the man knowing how. The soil simply produced the stalk, then the head, and finally the full kernel in the head all by itself. Significant changes often take place while those affected are unaware of what is happening. The 14th century was such a time. The papacy continued its normal manner of functioning while important ideas and social forces changed the face of Christianity. We call the period between 1300 and 1500 the age of the decline of the Middle Ages because the idea of Christendom, which unified the millennium between the 4th and 14th centuries, was under attack. Christendom was made possible by the harmony of two ideas, the Christian empire and the Catholic Church. The image of a Christian empire slowly faded in importance in the 12th and 13th centuries as papal influence spread. The significance of the 14th and 15th centuries lies not only in the further decline of the empire, but in the dramatic loss of papal prestige. The 14th century is too early to speak of nations in the modern sense of the term, but more and more people were getting used to the idea that they were French or English, for example, whenever their thoughts reached beyond their own town or region. And perhaps most important, they found it possible to think of their state functioning without direct papal guidance. In modern times, or modern terms, they began to think of secular and sacred affairs, a realm for the state as well as a realm for the church. Europe was slowly moving away from its feudal past. Land was less important. Hard cash gained greater importance. Increasingly, those at the top of the medieval structure realized that they had to command ever larger sources of revenue, which required a broader authority to tax. The struggle between the church and the national monarchies of England and France began the turmoil of the 14th century. Edward I ruled in England, Philip the Fair in France. Both were strong and confident, while they were at odds with each other over lands in France still under English control. To finance their costly campaigns, Edward and Philip decided to tax the clergy in their realms. But in the Pope's view, church revenues were taxable only by the church. In 1296, Boniface VIII had issued a document threatening excommunication for any lay ruler who taxed the clergy and for any churchman who paid those taxes without papal consent. But Edward and Philip were secular and unimpressed by threats from Rome. Edward replied that if the clergy did not pay, they would be stripped of all legal protection and their extensive properties would be seized by the king's sheriffs. Philip placed a complete embargo on the export of all gold, silver, and jewels from his domains, thus depriving the papal treasury of a major source of revenue from church collections in France. Faced with such stiff opposition, Boniface backed down, explaining that he had not meant to cut off clerical contributions for defense in times of dire need. Since the kings could decide what constituted defense and dire need, the victory for Edward and Philip was clear. Let's look at a new voice in Christendom. The royal victory, however, was far from complete. Encouraged by the success of the Jubilee year, Boniface concluded that the spiritual reverence shown to him throughout Christendom extended to the civil sphere as well. Concentrating his opposition against Philip The Pope determined to teach the French monarch a lesson. Philip, however, forcefully stated that Jesus Christ gave the church no temporal authority. In 1301, the king imprisoned a French bishop on charges of treason. Boniface ordered the official's release and withdrew his earlier concession on taxation of church lands. The next year, Philip responded by summoning representatives of the French nobility, clergy, and his National Assembly, and mustering their unanimous support in his conflict with the Pope. Several months later, Boniface issued the most extreme assertion of papal power in all of church history, making his meaning unmistakable. He declared that it is necessary for every human being to be subject to the Pope. The king's countermove was no less drastic. He prepared to have Boniface deposed on the ground that his election had been illegal. To execute his plan, he chose a shrewd lawyer named William of Nogaret. Nogaret was a master of the trumped-up charge. He had been known to approve the use of testimony obtained by means of torture, such as stripping a witness, smearing him with honey, and hanging him over a beehive. Can you imagine what that would be like? His case against Boniface included not only the illegitimacy of his election, but also heresy, simony, which means buying or selling church office, and immorality. Armed with authority from an assembly of French church officials, he rushed to Italy, determined to bring the Pope to France for trial before a special church council. Boniface, who was 86 years old at the time, had left the heat of Rome to spend summer in the foothills of the Apennine Mountains at his birthplace of Anagni. Nogaret and some troops he had marshaled broke in on Boniface in his bedroom. They kept him prisoner for several days. When the people of Anagni realized what was happening, they rose up and rescued Boniface. Humiliated, the aged pope died within weeks. The event revealed that European Christians no longer accepted papal interference in what they regarded as purely political matters. A king's power within his own country was a generally accepted fact. At the same time, an outrage against the Pope, even an unpopular one, was widely resented. Though Boniface was a target of widespread criticism, he was still regarded as the vicar or representative of Christ. Thus, even when they had no political terms for it, people in the early 14th century were beginning to distinguish secular and religious authority and to recognize the rights of each in its own place. This was a new development. Anagni came to symbolize the descent of papal power. When Boniface's successor in Rome died after a brief, ineffectual reign, Philip's daring coup bore its fruit. In 1305, the College of Cardinals elected a Frenchman, the Archbishop of Bordeaux, as Pope Clement V. Clement never set foot in Rome, preferring to stay in France, where he was always accessible to royal bidding. Let's turn to the captivity of the Holy Father. Clement's election marked the start of the 72-year period in church history called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, named after the long exile of the ancient Jews in Babylon. Following Clement, 6 successive popes, all of French origin, chose to reside in a little town called Avignon rather than in Rome. Avignon was located on the Rhone River, just across from the borders of Philip's domain. Under the popes, the town grew to a busy city of 80,000 with its immense clerical bureaucracy and papal palace. This removal of the papacy to Avignon was more than a matter of geography. In the thinking of the European people, Rome, the eternal city, stood not only for the idea of the apostolic succession of the church founded upon St. Peter, but also for the concept of Western universality, Roman power, Avignon, on the other hand, was surrounded on all sides by the French kingdom and was a mere tool in the hands of one nation, the power hungry French. The Avignon papacy was bitterly resented in Germany. In 1324, Emperor Louis the Bavarian moved against Pope John the 22nd by appealing to a general council. Among the scholars supporting such a move was Marsilius of Padua, who had fled from the University of Paris. In 1326, Marsilius and his colleague John of Gendon presented Louis with a writing that questioned the whole papal structure of the church and called for a democratic government. It asserted that the church was the community of all believers and that the priesthood was not superior to the laity. Neither popes nor bishops nor priests had received any special function from Christ. They served only as agents of the community of believers, which was represented by the General Council. This radical and revolutionary view of the church transformed the papacy into the executive office of the council and subordinated the pope to the authority of the council. The theory known as conciliarism would soon find a place in fact, not merely theory. Most of the hostility aimed at the Avignon papacy complained of the use and abuse of money. The decline in revenues from the papal states in Italy had brought the papal court to bankruptcy. To replace these funds and raise new ones, the Avignon popes resorted to numerous money-making schemes. Fees and taxes were charged for various privileges. For example, the popes introduced the rule that whenever a bishop was appointed, the first year's income, called an annat, should be given to the pope. To fill a vacancy, popes often transferred a bishop from another city and thus created more annats. Or perhaps the pope delayed the appointment and received all the income in the interim. This was called a reservation. The most lucrative practice, however, was the granting of indulgences. These were dispensed for the most minor reasons, from building bridges to waging war, and extravagant claims of their spiritual benefits mounted with each generation. Bitter feelings against the papacy increased, especially when the Pope demanded this tax or that revenue under threat of excommunication. By 1360, turmoil in Italy over the papal states, plus the outcries against the French domination of the papacy, made it clear that the Avignon papacy could not continue indefinitely. No one could foresee, however, the outrageous events the return to Rome would bring. In 1377, the aged Pope Gregory XI re-entered Rome. The joy over the re-establishment of the papacy in Rome was short-lived. Gregory's death within a year required a new papal election. The College of Cardinals, still heavily weighted with Frenchmen, yielded to the outcry of a Roman mob and chose an Italian. On April 18th, Easter Sunday, the new Pope, Urban VI, was crowned. All the cardinals were present. The summer months, however, along with Urban's dictatorial ways, brought second thoughts about his selection. In August, the cardinals suddenly informed all Europe that the people of Rome had forced the election of an apostate, meaning someone without true Christian faith or someone who was backslidden, to the chair of Peter, and that the proceedings were invalid. A month later, Urban responded by creating practically a new college of cardinals. For their part, the French cardinals chose from their own number another pope, Clement VII, and announced this fact to the various civil and church authorities. Clement VII moved about Italy and eventually sailed for France and Avignon. Let's turn to the Great Papal Schism. Thus, with Urban ruling from Rome and Clement ruling from Avignon, The period in papal history known as the Great Schism of the papacy begins. It lasted for 39 years. Each pope had his own college of cardinals, thereby ensuring the papal succession of his own choice. Each pope claimed to be the true vicar of Christ with the power to excommunicate those who did not acknowledge him. Both before and after this schism, there were pious people who rejected the claims of the Roman Church. But now the Church of Rome itself was engaged in both promoting and rejecting its own pope. The proper identity of the true pope was a matter of considerable importance to Christendom. Unfortunately, the only witnesses to the problem, the cardinals, contradicted themselves. If what they said in April was true, then what they said in September was untrue. If what they said in September was accurate, then what they said in April was not. It was left to universities, kings, bishops, dukes, and just about everyone else to decide who the true vicar of Christ was. France went with Clement, Italy with Urban. The Empire went with Urban, so did England. Scotland went with Clement, but within each country, minorities existed. Conflicts and riots broke out. Property was burned and crusades were preached. The church was divided. In 1395, leading professors at the University of Paris proposed that a general council representing the universal church should meet to heal the schism. But difficulties immediately arose. Canon law said that only the Pope could call the General Council, and only the Pope could ratify any decision of the General Council. Which Pope had those rights? In effect, a canon law prohibited the reunion of Christendom. Was necessity a higher law? We'll turn now to a new Pope elected. By 1409, a majority of the cardinals from both camps agreed that it was. They met for a general council at Pisa on the west coast of Italy. They deposed both claimants to the papal chair and elected a third man, Alexander V. Neither of the two deposed popes, however, would accept the action of the council. So the church now had not two, but three claimants to the chair of Peter. In other words, the papacy. Three popes at a time are too many by almost anyone's standards, especially when one of the popes preaches a crusade against another and starts selling indulgences to pay for it. This bizarre spectacle stirred Europe to prod its leaders into firm action. In 1414, the Holy Roman Emperor assembled at the German city of Constance, the most impressive church gathering of the era. For the first time, voting took place on a purely national basis. Instead of the traditional assembly of bishops, the council included lay representatives and was organized as a convention of nations. Each nation had one vote. The national structure of the council was highly significant, showing that the church was reluctantly coming to realize the new national alignment of power. At length, in 1417, the council got one papal incumbent to step aside, deposed the other two, and chose a new vicar of Christ, Martin V. While one deposed pope, Benedict XIII of Avignon, clung to his claim, for all practical purposes, the council in Constance ended the Great Schism. Necessity had triumphed, yet it was promptly denied. Martin reigned because of the council's action, yet as soon as he was pope, he repudiated or rejected all acts of the council except the one by which he ruled. The legal mind of the Roman Church had never encountered so great a contradiction of practice. Martin had good reason to deny the work of the council, for it raised an important question. Who is greater, a general council that creates the Pope or the Pope who claims supremacy over councils? The conciliar movement aimed at transforming the papacy into something like a limited monarchy. Constance solemnly decreed that general councils were superior to popes and that they should meet at regular intervals in the future. The pope called this heretical. His return to power, plus the inability of later councils to introduce much needed reforms, enabled the popes by 1450 to discredit the conciliar movement. They busied themselves not with religious reforms, but with Italian politics and patronage of the arts. Political corruption and immorality in the Vatican reached unbelievable heights under Rodrigo Borgia, who ruled as Alexander VI from 1492 to 1503. He was grossly immoral and obsessed with his passion to provide wealth and power for his children. Thus, Constance could be denied, but it could not be forgotten. Estrangement from the Pope was growing. People began to think in terms of national churches and the church governed by representative bodies. The challenge of the Protestant Reformation was already prepared. And now we'll turn to our final chapter in the textbook, chapter 24, Judgment in the Process of Time, which is about Wycliffe and Huss, two of the early reformers of the church before the official Protestant Reformation, who had, in some ways, many similar ideas, as we'll see. It has been observed that human systems, social and political, rise and thrive and then fall because the processes of time have their own built-in judgment. Institutions, which at first glance seem to be quite worthy, eventually crumble to ruins because the centuries themselves bring out the flaws. The medieval papacy was one of these systems that fell under judgment. The Babylonian captivity at Avignon and the great schism of the papacy that followed revealed its fundamental flaws. Basic reforms were in order, but after the failure of the conciliar movement, no significant reforms came from within the Church of Rome. The idea that the papal office was the channel of God's will died slowly. It was hard for anyone to imagine anything other than the necessity of the papacy, not only for religious life, but also as a means of sanctioning political rule. The Pope was the center of the Christian society on earth. Two brave souls, an Englishman named John Wycliffe and a Czech named John Huss, dared to suggest that the Christian church was something other than a visible organization on earth headed by the Pope. They paid dearly for even raising the possibility, but they saw clearly that the hour had come for judgment to fall on the church. Who were they, and how did they point the way to the future? Before we proceed, I want to give you a couple of alternate spellings. I've often seen these names spelled Wycliffe, seen it usually spelled with two F's and an E at the end. And then the name John Huss, also spelled like the name Jen, but it's still pronounced more like Jean because it's a Czech name. All right. And that also may be spelled with two S's, but I'm not going to put that in there. I'll just keep it like that. Okay, let's turn to the English zealots. The English zealot Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was a zealot, meaning he was very enthusiastic about his views. He was a controversial figure who despised neutrality. He prompted drastically different responses, either high praise or high condemnation. Confusion about the real Wycliffe is understandable. We really know little about the man. He had a habit of burying his character beneath pages of scholarly discourse, and while historians can follow his arguments well enough, few claim they understand him. Wycliffe's early life is as obscure as his personality. We are not even sure of the date of his birth. He grew up in northern England, but only became noteworthy when he enrolled as a student at Oxford. He secured his doctorate degree in 1372 and rose immediately to prominence as the leading professor at the university. The most important issue at the time was earthly dominion or lordship. All agreed that lordship arose from God. But how was this right to rule transmitted from God to earthly rulers? One widely held view argued that lordship was just only when it derived from the Roman Church. God had entrusted uh, the Pope with universal dominion over all temporal things and persons. Any authority exercised by simple rulers, those not approved by the church, was unlawful. Other teachers insisted that lordship depended less on the mediation of the church than on the fact that its possessor was in a state of grace, that he had committed no grievous sin. Wycliffe's professor, Richard Fitzralph, argued that this state of grace was no less necessary for a churchman than for a lay ruler. Undoubtedly influenced by his professor, Wycliffe entered into the debate and added an important idea. He argued that the English government had the divinely assigned responsibility to correct the abuses of the church within its realm and to relieve of office those church officials who persisted in their sin. The state could even seize the property of corrupt church officials. Not surprisingly, the Pope in 1377 condemned Wycliffe's teaching. The church might have moved against Wycliffe at that moment, but influential friends in England saw to it that the condemnation never went beyond threats. The long range significance of Wycliffe's teaching on dominion lies in its link with the Protestant Reformation. It was the English reformers' way of emphasizing the spiritual freedom of the righteous person who is a possessor of a dominion founded on grace. Every person, priest or layman, holds an equal place in the eyes of God. The personal relation between a person and God is essential. Character is the one basis of office. The mediating priesthood and worship practices, especially the sacrificial mass of the medieval church, are not as essential as character. Thus, Wycliffe anticipates Luther's doctrine by faith alone, or Luther's doctrine of justification uh, by faith alone. This doctrine of dominion, founded in grace, proved to be only the first of Wycliffe's controversial points. The decisive year of his reforming career was 1378, the year of the Great Schism in the papacy. Faced with this schism, Wycliffe became more radical in his assessment of the church and its need for reform. Wycliffe's early views of the papacy were shaped by his emphasis on apostolic poverty. He insisted that those who sat in St. Peter's chair should be, like the Apostle Peter, without silver or gold. He held that the Bible's prescription for the papacy consisted in a poor and humble life spent in the service of the church, setting before God's people an example of Christian goodness. Such a view leaves no room for the temporal power of the Pope. The concept of the papacy as a political force was sacrilegious or blasphemous to Wycliffe. He denounced the worldliness and luxury of the popes. In one sense, Wycliffe welcomed the Great Schism. The spectacle of two rival popes excommunicating each other seemed to him to be a confirmation for all to see of the spiritual bankruptcy of the office and the need to put something else in its place. As the schism continued, Wycliffe's view hardened. He came to believe that the Pope was Antichrist, a figure of evil who stood as a false Messiah, claiming allegiance to self that ultimately opposed Christ. If there were two of them condemning each other, they simply shared this unholy title. And that was common for later reformers also to think of the Pope as the Antichrist. And even some Protestants today may tend to think that way. Uh, in a steady stream of charges, Wycliffe showed how far the papacy had departed from the simple faith and practice of Christ and his disciples, in contrast to the truth of Christ, who lived in poverty and refused temporal dominion. He claimed the Pope is false, laboring for worldly magnificence and seeking temporal dominion. Wycliffe treated with scorn the idea that because Peter died in Rome, every bishop of Rome is to be set above all of Christendom. Wycliffe declared that Christ alone is the head of the church and called for judgment on the Pope, who has exalted himself above God. Let's turn to from Reformer to Protestant. Thus, the Reformer took the great step of his life. He passed from an Orthodox preacher eager for the reform of the existing international Roman Church into a Protestant. We can put that in quotation marks to use a later term, since he actually lived before the official Protestant Reformation. Some call him a proto Protestant or the morning star of the Reformation. Wycliffe's break with the papacy was part of a new idea that he had formed of the church. He accepted the ancient division of the church into three parts: one triumphant in heaven, one militant on earth, and one asleep in purgatory. But he defined the church on earth as the whole number of the elect, containing only those that shall be saved. He developed a strong view of predestination, arguing that no one knew whether or not he or she was truly part of the church. From this doctrine of an invisible church of the elect, Wycliffe drew some practical conclusions. The church is a unity that knows nothing of papal premises or hierarchies, of the orders of monks, friars, and priests. The salvation of the elect can also not be conditioned by the worship practices of the church, masses, indulgences, or penances. In time, Wycliffe challenged the whole range of medieval beliefs and practices: pardons, indulgences, absolutions, pilgrimages, the worship of images, the adoration of the saints, the treasury of saints' merits laid up at the reserve of the Pope, and the distinction between forgivable and mortal sins. He retained belief in purgatory and extreme unction, though he admitted he could not find the practice of extreme unction in the Bible. He was willing to accept other practices if they increased devotion. He held confession to be useful, provided it was voluntary and made to a suitable person, best of all if it were made in public. He also saw preaching as being more valuable than the administration of the sacraments. All right, let's break here and we'll continue in just a moment.